Good morning. Hey, my name is Josh. I am the pastor here at Church on the Drive, and I'm so glad that you're here with us, whether you're here in the room or you are participating online. We're glad we get to be together this morning. We are today continuing a series called Troublemakers, where we're looking at this guy in the earliest of the church iteration, this guy who kind of kicked off all this missionary movement, a guy you have probably heard of, a man named Paul. By most accounts, there is almost no one outside of Jesus who is as influential on Western culture as this guy named Paul of Tarsus. Maybe you heard of him. No big deal, right? So we're looking at his life and a few of the things that he did because Paul had this encounter with Jesus. He was this way, and then he had this encounter with Jesus that totally reshaped his life. He had been a persecutor of Christians, someone who led to arrest of Christians, and then suddenly he had this encounter. Something changed within him, something totally changed, and suddenly he was leading Christians. What he said happened was he had an encounter with a resurrected from the dead Jesus who spoke directly to him. Now, you can say what you want about your feelings about the possibility of a resurrection. The thing is, though, Paul had no reason to change course. Paul was doing everything right. Paul was rising rapidly through the ranks as this persecutor, this guy who was leading the fight against this sect within Judaism that was being called the Way, which ultimately becomes Christianity. Everybody was applauding him for this. And then suddenly he changes direction. He said it was because he encountered the resurrected Jesus. It reshaped his life. Everything changed in that moment for him. And so what he started doing eventually was going around the known world, around the Mediterranean world, and he started kind of jumping into local cities and towns and villages that had never heard of this guy Jesus. They knew about a Messiah, like the possibility of one, and how God had been promising one and how they had been praying for one, but they had never heard of this Jesus guy yet. And he shows up to their local synagogues because Paul was Jewish, as were almost all the first Christians at first. And he says, hey, I'm here. Jewish brothers and sisters, let me tell you about the Messiah that God has sent us, and not just us, but a Messiah for the entire world. His name is Jesus, and God sent him. God sent him for us, and God made a way for us to be reconciled back to God. And not just us, but also all of our non-Jewish brothers and sisters too. We all have a way to be close to God again because of Jesus. And they said, well, where's Jesus at? He said, well, I'm glad you asked that question. Jesus was born of a virgin. There was this immaculate conception that took place, and Jesus lived this sinless life. But then because he was so good at what he did, and because what he said challenged the status quo, because he was a troublemaker in the eyes of the people who held all this authority and power, they killed him. And when everybody heard that in the synagogue, they probably went, well, I guess that's too good to be true, I guess. And he goes, no, that's not the end of the story. That's not the end of the story. The rest of the story is he didn't stay dead. God raised him from the dead. God resurrected him from the dead. That had never happened. Hasn't happened since. God had raised him from the dead. He didn't stay dead. He lives forevermore at the right hand of God. He appeared to me, Paul said. He appeared to me and he talked to me and he told me what I was doing was wrong and I needed to get on this course. And so that's why I'm in front of you today. I want you to begin believing in that Jesus and following that Jesus and making him the king of your life. He is the king, whether you acknowledge him or not. You should follow him as king. Your life will be better. Friends, I'm going to tell you the same thing this morning. If you didn't remember that you walked into church today, let me tell you real quickly, following Jesus is the best way to live and will make you better at life. I promise you that. We're going to talk about why that is, but I want you to understand that's where we're coming from. That's where we're starting today. Following Jesus is the best way to live and will make you better at life in general. It's also going to cause you to come into conflict with others sometimes. Because whenever we make this big claim as followers of Jesus, that Jesus is the king and that everybody else should follow him, you have to understand, when you say somebody else that Jesus is king, there's always going to be somebody else going, well, I want to be king. Right? It doesn't matter if you're talking about the King of England or your life. When you say this person is king, there's always somebody else standing off on the side who would also like to be king. And so when followers of Jesus say, well, Jesus is king, and Jesus determines what I do or what I don't do, and how I talk and how I don't talk, and the things that I celebrate and the things I don't celebrate, and the people I am around and the people I'm not around. When we say those things, there's always going to be somebody else who hasn't made Jesus king, who can't quite comprehend or understand why you would act that way. And they're going to be a little bit offended. There's going to be trouble that comes as a result. Just a little bit, sometimes more than others, but there will be a little bit of trouble that comes. So like Paul, our goal is never to be offensive, never to be hurtful, never to be harmful to anybody else. We always want to be kind. We always need to be gracious. But the very nature of saying Jesus is king is going to lead us to have a little bit of trouble with other people who don't make Jesus king in their life. And that's kind of the problem for some of us. We've been conditioned by a society that says, if I have trouble with someone else, then they are the problem and they need to be eliminated. There needs to be something done about them. We've been conditioned by things like this, where we say words are violence, right? Words are violence. And so if somebody says something that I disagree with, then they're being violent against me. If they say something about me or the things I believe, then somehow, quote unquote, they're being violent against me. That doesn't make any sense. That's not true at all. They're words. But the idea that words are violence is keeping actual debate and conversation from happening. We have to be able to have conversations about things in a courteous and generous way with each other. But instead, we're avoiding it. Yeah, we've been told disagreement with each other equals hate. We've been told that there are these groups of people out there who, if they get their way, they're going to ruin our society. They're going to ruin families. They're going to ruin this. They're going to ruin that. And so before they ruin it, we're going to go out and we're going to try and ruin them. We're going to ruin them before they ruin all of us. Nothing could be more anti-Christ than that type of approach. That type of approach, there's no room for that in the life of a follower of Jesus. And so for a lot of people, the idea that I would go and be anywhere near a troublemaker and put myself in danger of making other people mad or put myself in danger of making other people hate me or make other people think I hate them, that's not appealing. That's not appetizing at all. And so a lot of us say, I'm just going to be quiet about my faith. I'm never going to talk about it. I'm never going to be pushy at all. I'm never going to even remotely act different than other people around me. But that's a problem too. Because Jesus told us, go into all the world. Teach them everything I taught you. Baptize them. We've got to talk about this King Jesus, because following Jesus is the best way to live and will make you better at life. If I have the best way to live, why wouldn't I tell other people about it? What if I told you that being this Jesus-following troublemaker doesn't mean you have to be a jerk? That you can be kind, that you can be loving, that you can be good as you make a little bit of trouble for Jesus. After Paul left Thessalonica, I guess when I say he left Thessalonica, what I really mean is he escaped under cover of darkness, because they had started these riots to get him to leave the city, and he left under cover of darkness so that he wouldn't die on his way out. He went to this town called Berea, and in Berea he had a lot of the same success that he had in Thessalonica. If you don't remember, last week we talked about Paul in Thessalonica, and basically what happened was he started off at a synagogue and convinced a good number of the people there that Jesus was the Messiah, which just means that he's this king that God had anointed. He convinces everybody, a bunch of people, that Jesus was the Messiah. And then he convinced these non-Jews also in the area that Jesus was the Messiah. And a lot of people began following Jesus, and they're taking their cues from Paul. Well, there was a group of people who did not like this. They said, we don't want this guy. He's messing up our status quo. He's messing up our authority structures. He's ruining everything we've got. He says, we're going to get him. And so that's when they started the riots, and they start trying to get him out of there. Well, Paul goes to Berea, a town nearby, and he goes straight to the synagogue, and he starts talking again. And again, there are people who come to faith, Jews and non-Jews. Same story, except this time, the people that he's talking to, they're researching everything he says. So Paul isn't just super persuasive. He doesn't have some crazy shtick that he's up there trying to win people over with, right? He's not telling them you need to turn or burn, or like now's the time or anything like that. He doesn't have any crazy marketing scheme. He doesn't have lights. He doesn't have a loud sound system and a cool band. He doesn't have any of those things. He's not, by most accounts, he wasn't even that great of a speaker. Like within Scripture, you can find where he admits he's probably not as good as some of these other people. But he is able to talk about his faith. He is a very smart guy, a very well-educated guy. And the people he's talking to respond to that. So they're listening to him, and he's saying, here's how I know Jesus was the Messiah. Here's how I know he reigns forever. Here's how I know all of these things. And they go, okay, let me check this with the Scripture that God gave us. Right, so they're going back, and they're looking at all the stuff in the Hebrew Bible. They're checking all of these things, and it turns out Paul knows what he's talking about. It turns out Paul is exactly right. It turns out he's exactly right about this Jesus character. But then the Thessalonians find out he's in Berea, and they can't have him being successful there. They can't have him being successful there. So they marshal the troops, and they head over to Berea, and they start to run Paul out over there. They start riots over there again. And so Paul has to leave quickly. And he heads for this place called Athens. You may remember Athens. Athens was this beautiful little town on the Greek peninsula. It's known from the classical era as being a place of incredible literature, incredible sculpture, incredible philosophy, just a great cultural center for the world. You can still go there today. You can still see so many things. It's a wonder to behold. I wonder what it would have been like in its heyday. See, when Paul shows up, it's actually probably about 400 or 500 years past its heyday, but it's still... it left an indelible mark on the world, such an indelible mark, by the way, that the Romans kind of let them just do whatever they wanted to do in Athens. The Romans didn't come in and say, all right, you're going to do it just like this and just like this and just like this. They admired the Athenians so much that they let them kind of exist how they wanted to, have their own governmental structures as long as they were friendly to Rome. That was unheard of. Oh, you're talking about a city that with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Zeno and Epicurus. You're talking about incredible sculptors, all sorts of classical stuff, right? Amazing things. That's the city that Paul walked into. This is a city that knows that about itself too. In the marketplace, there were these groups of philosophers that went back and forth with each other about different philosophies and things. They would stand in the marketplace, and that's where they taught, because they didn't have YouTube channels back then. They didn't have news stations. They couldn't just put things out. They had to teach there. And if you wanted to be a philosopher, you had to go there, and you had to hold your own a little bit. You had to be able to discuss and to dialogue. Paul ends up in that city, the one that's highly respected around the world, still is today, was known for being this center of culture. Paul goes to the synagogue first, and he starts talking with them there. But as he's in town, he's looking around at all the sculptures, and suddenly he realizes these aren't just sculptures. These are idols. These are idols to the many gods that the Athenians were willing to worship, or people within Athens were willing to spend time worshiping. And he's distressed by this. He kind of is weirded out by it too. Remember, Paul comes from a Jewish background. Idols weren't allowed at all. But now as a Jesus follower, it's even more for him. And so he starts having these conversations in the marketplace. They called it the Agora, if you ever want to like save that for your Jeopardy trivia knowledge or something like that. He would spend time in there talking with people. Paul was one of those guys that he couldn't help but have this conversation about what he was thinking. And usually what he was thinking about was how Jesus had changed everything. Can you imagine? Is there something in your life that just seems to bubble up all the time? Like you just have to talk about that thing. Like if you were in seventh grade and really into Pokemon or something like that. Like not even seventh grade. So my daughter their little friend group is into Pokemon right now. So every time we pass a McDonald's, Dad, can we go to McDonald's? No. Why do you want to go to McDonald's? They got Pokemon there. They got Pokemon in the Happy Meal. That's why she wants me to go to McDonald's. Daddy, can you put this thing in my bag? What is it? It's like this little tin. She goes, that's where I got all my Pokemon cards. We're going to play with them at school. Are you serious? I didn't know we were doing that. And everything starts talking about Pokemon. I want to see if they got a Pokemon TV show. We go through the store. There's a Pokemon over there. I want to see all that. I wonder what that might be for you. Is there something that the second it comes up, you can talk forever about, or you want to talk forever about? You want to bring it up all the time? For Paul, it was this whole Jesus thing. And so he's in this marketplace and he starts talking with people and he says, yeah, look at all these idols. Like, this is crazy. You guys know you don't have to do that, right? Let me tell you about Jesus. Let me tell you about the God of the universe and how this is different and how it's all like that. Now, keep in mind, nearby in the same marketplace, there are these philosophers. And they're used to holding court. And they've been there for about 350 years at this point, these schools of philosophical thought, and they've been owning the corner. And to be honest with you, they ran the show then, and they still kind of run the show now. We haven't really improved very much on philosophy since the time of the Epicureans and the Stoics of Paul's day. So they're well entrenched in Athenian society in the city where to be a philosopher was incredible. It was to be somebody. And that's where we're going to pick up today. Paul is in this marketplace, and a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him, right? So imagine, they just probably saw him over starting some kerfuffle with somebody, talking about the God of the universe. They wander over, and they go, hey, what's going on over here? And he tells them, and they start debating. Some of them ask, what is this babbler trying to say? So you know they're not really buying what he's saying at first, yeah? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Now, the resurrection was kind of a foreign idea. It wasn't something that Greeks believed in. This wasn't part of it. Jesus would have been totally foreign to the Greek pantheon. It's not something that they would have gone with. But Paul is trying to engage, and they're doing all this stuff. Now, let me remind you who these Epicureans and Stoics are, in case you're like me and you forget pretty easily. So the Epicureans were this philosophical group started by a guy named Epicurus there in Athens, and they basically believed this. Firstly, that pleasure was the chief end of life. The chief end. That's what life is all about. That's what you want to achieve. And the greatest pleasure was a tranquil life, where there were no problems, there was no resentment, there wasn't any anger. Some of you, this is sounding really good already, yeah? You're already all about this. And you're like, yeah, and I get to eat as many cheeseburgers as I want. All of those things. Pleasure was the chief end of life. They also said, gods may exist, but they aren't interested. They aren't interested in the affairs of humanity. They don't care. So in modern terms, we're talking kind of about a deistic sort of situation where God sets things in motion and just boom, y'all have fun. That's the Epicureans. The Stoics, however, were basically pantheistic. They believed that God was kind of this world soul thing that we all lived within and moved about in and did. So everything was interconnected for that reason. As a result, they aimed to live consistently with nature. They wanted to make sure that they were in harmony with nature and doing all of that stuff. Some of y'all, you hippies out there, you're loving this too. I like that. They wanted to live consistently with nature. Why? Because we're all part of the same thing. They emphasized, though, that there was this human rational ability that went beyond that of animals and the rest of creation. So they said we should use that for the good. Because they believed that we were all kind of together, they also believed that everybody who was part of this world soul thing were part of a world state. And that we were all citizens, equal citizens, part of this world state. And so that everybody had something to offer, everybody was equal within it. There were no class distinctions. They tried to break those down. There were no ethnic distinctions. And because we were all dependent on each other, because we all were in this together, they were dedicated to moral earnestness and to duty. They wanted to live upright lives. They felt it was very, very important. This is who Paul was arguing with. This is who Paul was arguing with. These were people who were well-versed in philosophy, many of them who'd been thinking about this and using the proper philosophical language and the proper arguments for years and years and years. And suddenly there's this guy who comes out of Israel just saying stuff in the market. He looks different. He probably had a bit of an accent, probably didn't speak with the best tone, probably stood wrong. And then he's talking about resurrection and stuff like that. And so they call him a babbler. They say, hey, what is babbler saying? Actually, in the Greek, that word it literally translated means seed picker. They're trying to discredit him, to discount him. They're saying this guy doesn't know anything. A seed picker, because they're in the marketplace, and what some people would do, the ones who were poor and didn't have very many means, they would go around and they would pick up the seeds and the scraps that fell, and they would use those to feed themselves. They would use the scraps and the seeds. The ones who didn't have anything of their own, they're trying to piece together little things that they can grab off the ground. They're saying this guy is a seed picker, a scrap picker. He's a second-rate philosopher, spewing second-rate philosophy about stuff we don't care about. They're really trying to downplay this guy, Paul. They're using this Athenian slang to do it. Now, they're calling him a seed picker. Some of them probably saw him as a religious charlatan. There were no shortage of those in the agora at that time. There were a lot of religious charlatans who would show up and say, let me tell you about this new God that's out there. You need to know about this one. And some people would be convinced, and some people would not be convinced. These religious charlatans would take advantage of the Athenians' willingness to engage with new philosophy and new religions. They were always on the search for something new. They wanted to constantly be improving and thinking about stuff. So they saw this guy and said, he doesn't know anything. He's one of those religious charlatans. But they want to hear a little bit more. They actually want to know some more. So they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? They go on, you are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. Now, the Areopagus was actually a little bit of a court, and it had originally met on this hillside called the Hill of Ares. This was where they met to discuss things like moral stuff, sometimes some civil court things, big stuff happening in Athens, especially related to moral and philosophical things. So this was a lot of people who were very well versed in philosophy, very, very thoughtful people, very smart people. Some of the most respected members of Athenian society were part of this Areopagus. They bring Paul here. Now, sometimes they would discuss things like a murder case or something like that. Most of the time, though, they were discussing moral stuff and philosophical things. Paul isn't brought to the Areopagus as to be vilified. He's not brought there to be arrested or anything like that. This isn't a civil trial. They really, truly, genuinely want to hear from Paul. And so they say, hey, can you tell us more about this new God thing that you're talking about? Well, Paul is excited then. He's absolutely excited then. This is the door that opens for him. Friends, can I tell you that if you're going around and you're stirring up trouble in your life, if you're living for Jesus in a way that makes people pay attention, or if you're proclaiming Jesus with your words too, if you're doing those things every once in a while, you're going to get an open door. And you've got to be ready to walk through that door. You got to be ready to have that conversation, to talk about that thing. Those opportunities don't always come up. But when they do, you've got to be ready. Paul is ready, and he knows exactly what to say. So Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. So he compliments them right off the bat. He says, you're very religious. He's not condescending. He's not a jerk. He's nothing like that. You are very religious. You mean well. You're devout. You're pious. He goes on. And here's how I know. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Can you imagine? There's all these idols, all these altars everywhere, to this God, to that God, the God of the sea, the God of seahorses, the God of this, the God of that, the God of this, the God of that, to the unknown God, just in case we miss one and we don't want to make him mad. That's the idea. He says, so you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. And so Paul says, there is a God. There is this unknown God, this one that you don't know about. He speaks to them in terms they can understand. He meets them where they're at, and he's ready to have this conversation. Again, he's not a jerk. He's gracious. He's kind. But he's also not afraid of them because he knows what he's talking about. He knows what it is he believes, and he knows why he believes it. He knows what it's done in his life. And he starts talking to them about this unknown God. He says, this unknown God that you're talking about, let me tell you about him. He's bigger. He's badder. He's stronger. He's better than anything you could ever imagine. There is no one you could conceive of that could ever rival him. You're talking about Zeus? You're talking about Apollos? No. This God is the God of heaven and earth, created it all. And as a result, all of it belongs to him. He's not in this stuff, but it all belongs to him. He has a say over everything that happens, and he has a say over who it happens to. He can do whatever he wants, but he is good. And he hasn't removed himself entirely. No, instead, he is actively involved. And let me tell you how he's actively involved. Throughout history, he's always made a way for people to catch glimpses of him and wanted them to search for him. And if they would find him. But so many of us, we walk away and we walk away. But God is actively involved. And so what God did was God sent his one and only son, Jesus, to come so that we might be reconciled to God. He goes, and you need to follow this, Jesus. He says, now, there were, in former times, y'all didn't worship him because you didn't know about him. You didn't know about him, but now you do, and you better start to worship him. Here's why. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice, just making it right, by the man he has appointed. Talking about Jesus. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Like, this is the proof. This is the proof that what I'm telling you is true. Ask around. This guy, Jesus, it really happened. Now, this is the defining characteristic of Christian thought, by the way. That Jesus was raised from the dead. This is the starting point of our faith. This is the dividing line. Either Jesus was raised from the dead and everything changed, or Jesus wasn't raised from the dead and nothing changed. He either was who he said he was, or he wasn't. I believe the facts show that Jesus was who he said he was. I believe that the overwhelming evidence shows that. But, like many people you and I will encounter today, this happens. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. That's because the resurrection wasn't a thing. The resurrection was not a thing. In fact, in that very court, on its first day, in that very court, they were quoting an ancient work of literature where they said there was no resurrection. There wasn't a belief in a resurrection in the Greek pantheon and in the Greek religion at the time. So they openly sneered at this. But others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. And at that, Paul left the council. Friends, there will be people, when you talk about Jesus and what Jesus has done in your life, there will be people who say no. Jesus couldn't convince everybody. Paul didn't convince everybody. You're not going to convince everybody. And it's not just because you're doing a poor job trying to convince them. Some people just aren't going to receive it yet. They're just not going to listen. It's not there for them yet. They're not going to allow themselves sometimes. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep talking, though. Because some of the people you talk to are going to receive this message about Jesus. In fact, what we find out is there was somebody on this Areopagus court who ultimately receives Jesus and becomes the bishop, the first bishop of Athens. Other people came to Christ too, but you got to keep going. The point is that Paul wasn't intimidated. Paul didn't back away. Paul didn't give up because he'd been chased out of Thessalonica and Berea. He didn't stop doing any of this stuff. He kept stirring up a little bit of trouble. And that doesn't mean that you get to go out there and you're a jerk or you're mean or you're fighting for your rights or anything like that. Good troublemakers cause others to think. When you're out there stirring up the world and trying to be a good Jesus follower, when you're living for Jesus, when you're living in a way that you don't even have to use words to preach, when you're going out and you're having conversations about Jesus with other people, your goal should at least be to get other people to think. God will handle the rest. The Holy Spirit will draw people to God. Your goal is to help others think. So often we feel like we got to shout people down or we've got to do this or do that. We got to fight for this or fight for that. I get so embarrassed when I see Christians trying to outshout non-Christians when it comes to religious arguments. It's like, man, God's big enough to handle all this. He doesn't need you shouting to prove his point. It's almost as embarrassing for me when I see Christians make ridiculous arguments. The so-called philosophical or theological or even wannabe scientific arguments. And these arguments sound good to them and their friends because they're in this little echo chamber where everybody agrees. But the second they venture out of that little echo chamber and they try to engage with the outside world, everybody else is laughing at them because arguments don't make any sense. No, you need to be able to make other people think. So, as you go about being a troublemaker, I want to challenge you to do three things, okay? As you go about making other people think, I want you to first understand why and what you believe. What do you believe? And then why do you believe it? So many of us, we just kind of blithely go through life, right? And it's great that you're here on a Sunday. It's great that you show up. I love that, and it's going to be good for you. We're going to talk about hard stuff all the time. But you got to do the hard work of reflecting on what you believe and why you believe it. Because one day when you're having a conversation about Jesus, somebody's going to ask you. And you need to be able to give a reason, just like Paul was able to give a reason. So understand why and what you believe. If you ever want to read a book to help you with this, there's a great one by a guy named Paul Little called Know What You Believe. I didn't agree with everything he said in it. I rarely do, but it really helped me to reflect. So the second thing is this. Be able to make your case for others to understand. If you understand why you believe what you believe, the next step is being able to get that point across. I'm not saying you have to suddenly be able to convince the world. You don't have to be a world-class preacher to get your point across. But be able to make your case with a friend. Say you're sitting down over coffee with a friend who wants to know why you're so invested in this Jesus thing. At least be able to get your point across there. Here's the third thing. Live an unquestionably good life. Live in a way that you are, in the old school way of saying it, above reproach. That nobody can say a bad word about you. That when you say, I think Jesus is king, they go, yeah, well, you didn't think that on Saturday night. Live an unquestionably good life. It just adds value to your argument about Jesus. Friends, I think that as you go about and you start making some good trouble out there, you're going to have to make other people think a little bit. You can be gracious as you do it. You can be kind as you do it, and you should. So maybe today, we're talking, and all of this is kind of ringing in your ears a little bit. This is something the Lord maybe has been dealing with you already on. And you're like, I don't know why I believe what I believe. I haven't really thought this out as far as I thought I had, and I don't know if I'm ready to have a conversation about this, and I don't even know what to do. Here's what I want to do this morning. I want to pray over you and over everyone else here. And I want to invite you to begin reflecting on that stuff and studying these things. I'm not here to condemn you. I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here to challenge you to go deeper in your faith. I'm here to challenge you to go deeper and further in your walk with Jesus. Because following Jesus is the best way to live and will make you better at life. And it will give hope to the people around you. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you for your goodness to us. I thank you that while we were far from you, you sent Jesus for us. I thank you that we are never alone, that your Holy Spirit always is with us and guiding us and calling us. I pray for my brothers and sisters here that you would help us as we go through life. Give us the courage to stir up a little trouble with those conversations we have with people who don't believe in you. Give us the courage to be the troublemakers who live in a way that just kind of causes people to go, what are they doing? I don't understand. Give us the courage to live out our convictions and to know what those things are. And I pray that as a result of being here today, my sisters and my brothers would bring people to Christ just because they made them think. Help us to be ready, and when the opportunity presents itself, help us to walk through that door. Because a life apart from you isn't something we want for anybody. We can't stand it for anybody any longer. We want people to have this relationship with the God of the universe who loves them. Help us, Lord. Amen. Would you stand as we sing together?